All right, I know this is finals, so there's many people busy working away upstairs, last minute details on their projects. Those of you here this evening are very much in for a treat. So thank you for coming to this, the last lecture of the Cultural Events Series in the Faculty of Architecture for this academic year. For those of you who don't know me, I am Lisa Landrum, Associate Dean Research. I'm also the chair of the Cultural Events Committee. And I'm very happy to have this role with the assistance of Brandy O'Reilly and Madeline Defoe. And you know, for Madeline and I, this is the last cultural events, except for year-end exhibition, which is just this little thing on the horizon. But thank you, Madeline, for all of the work this year, putting together these lectures. It is a lot of work that happens behind the scenes, and Madeline does a superior job at all of the details, so thank you. So I would also like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I would also like to acknowledge that this evening's lecture is made possible through the generous support and vision of the Harlyn Thompson Lectureship Fund. So Professor Harlyn Thompson, who is usually here, but is not here this evening, unfortunately, he was Dean of this Faculty of Architecture from 1980 to 84. He established this fund 5 years ago to support visiting lectures by distinguished speakers whose research and practice enhance our appreciation for human factors in the design of the built environment. The aim is to foster interdisciplinary understanding for how human interaction with settings can inspire design. And you know, this is really important at a time when it's too easy to become enthralled with the aesthetic object or distracted by the technologies that produce them. This lectureship fund reminds us that people matter in design processes and that humanistic and social values are core to our discipline. So we are going to definitely learn about some amazing human interactions with environments this evening. But first, please join me in expressing our gratitude to Harlyn Thompson. Okay, so now to introduce Bryony Roberts. So Bryony is an architectural designer and scholar based in New York City with degrees from Yale and Princeton University. Her practice integrates methods from architecture, art, dance, social practice, and she integrates these to respond to complex cultural sites. She has collaboratively created several site-specific choreographic installations that occupy, reenact, and re-envision historically charged spaces, including the Mies van der Rohe Design Federal Plaza as part of the inaugural Chicago Architecture Biennale in 2015, and the Michelangelo Design Capitoline Hill in Rome, among others, which we will see momentarily. So in recognition of her contributions to rethinking architecture and its forms of inhabitation, to revealing the transformative power of place and community, and to improving people's lives and making cities stronger, Bryony has been awarded the 2018 Architectural League Prize, the 2018 Miller Prize, and Miller is named after the famous philanthropic client of Eero Saarinen, the 2018 McDowell Colony Fellowship in Architecture, and the Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome, and she was based there in 2015-16. She has also earned support from the National Endowment for the Arts and Graham Foundation. So her experimental approach to social agency influences her teaching as well, presently at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation in New York City, and previously at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, as well as at SCI-Arc in Los Angeles. Her work is published in several books and journals, including Harvard Design Magazine, Log, and Architectural Record, and she has lectured extensively, and we are delighted to host her in Winnipeg this evening. So please join me in welcoming Bryony Roberts.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me? Is it on? Yeah, okay. I'm just going to attach this as I talk. So thank you so much, Lisa, for that introduction, and also just for the invitation to be here. It's such a pleasure. I've never been to Winnipeg or Manitoba, and it's just been a pleasure so far to visit the school and be hosted so generously by you two. So I thought I would start by introducing the sort of conceptual framework behind my work and then talk about some specific projects. So to begin with the word indiscrete, which is an old word that's not used very much anymore. It combines the Latin of in, meaning not, and discretus, meaning separate. So together they mean not separate or distinguishable. And for me, this is a useful word to talk about my practice because I'm not interested in making architecture that is discrete or autonomous from its environment, but rather that's folded into the longer time cycles of a site. So it's responsive to existing architecture, to social histories, to infrastructure. And I've been exploring this across a range of scales, from projects that are about material investigations and perception, to thinking about reconfiguring building systems, and at the urban scale, looking at how new construction can respond to existing buildings and frame public space together. But all of these projects are really fundamentally about the relationship between architecture and social experience, which is ultimately an impossible thing to ever know or prove. But it's that edge between the tangible and the intangible that I find most challenging and also rewarding to work on. Which brings me to the second kind of indiscrete, something we're more familiar with the same root, but means having, showing, or proceeding from too great a readiness to reveal things that should remain private or secret. And normally this is considered a bad quality, but I think actually in architecture right now it's really important that we be more indiscreet, meaning we start telling some of the things that have been secret, that have been kept sort of under wraps, such as the ways in which architecture and urbanism have sometimes had negative impacts on the communities in which they were built, or how design shapes experiences of gender and sexuality. So in general, it's a look towards very specific individual experiences of space and seeing how an understanding of specificity can start to counteract our kind of abstract, totalizing notions about what architecture can do. And I think this is a really important way of working right now because as architects, often in schools we learn how to design buildings from scratch, from nothing, but so often we're actually called to act on sites that are already dense with existing buildings, infrastructure, and social use. So much of the world is already covered with building stock. So how do we jump into these situations and work in a responsive, intelligent way? So I think this is also about the sources of knowledge that are the basis for what we do as designers. Historically, architecture has often brought abstract, universal, and transcendent kinds of knowledge into specific circumstances. But what I think is really interesting right now is how in all of these different related fields, there's a sort of convergence around asking, what if we start with specific, situated, and bodily knowledge? What if that's the beginning of a process of design or of community engagement? How can that actually bring different kinds of knowledge into a process? So this is kind of a map of some of my intellectual interests. And one of the most inspiring figures for me is Donna Haraway, who talks about partial, locatable, critical knowledges sustaining the possibility of webs of connections. So how can we learn from individual experience, not keep it isolated just to the scale of the individual, but manage to find connections between individuals to start to undo common assumptions? So what I'm going to talk about today is basically how these kinds of, these sources of knowledge can start to impact architecture. Specifically the ways that we think about architectural techniques like representation, form making, materiality, and authorship. So I'll talk about my practice along those 4 themes, and then we'll touch a little bit on my teaching as well if we have time, since it's very related to what you all are doing right now. So to begin with representation, I think representation is fundamentally connected to knowledge, because as architects, representation is often how we show the way we're analyzing the world, how we communicate with others. So I think it's important to question the foundations of representation in our discipline. We're often told that architectural drawing, at least the way that we use it now, orthographic projection, originated in the Italian Renaissance in the 1500s. When I was in Rome, I spent some time looking at drawings by people like Antonio da Sangallo and Baldassare Peruzzi, who are sort of famous for producing techniques of doing measured plans, sections, and elevations. And what I found was that in order to get to that point, they started with all these sort of messy, scratchy drawings that were surveys of existing buildings. So the techniques that we know for projecting imagined structures actually came from this process of physically wrestling with existing buildings. And this was a very tactile and also interpersonal process using this instrument, the bussola per rilievi, the surveying compass. And the process involved having a compass and then a long chain. And often two people would do this together, much like we currently survey sites. So two people would sort of press this instrument up against the wall, get these coordinates, and then lay out a chain in order to get the length. And what you see are the notations of the orientation and also the length. And so this process of sort of moving across, touching, measuring this building produced orthographic projection. But the presentation drawings erased that whole process. So in this drawing by Antonio da Sangallo, he's drawing the Pantheon, but he's actually abstracting it and even lying a little bit because he creates these symmetrical stairs when there's actually only one. So in that process, he is showing this idealized version. And often when we think about Renaissance drawing, we think of these sort of purely graphic representations that don't show us process or materiality. In this case, in Serlio's reproduction, the dimensions are on the opposite page. They're sort of isolated from the drawing. And this is what had become sort of canonical architectural representation. So I'm interested in getting back to that question of how did representation actually come from contact, from materiality, from a kind of interpersonal exchange with a site. So I've done a bunch of different experiments around this, ranging from objects that sort of through mass measure the space between bodies and structures, working with casting and imprinting. But then I thought I would show you a video of a performance in the Campidoglio in Rome, which is the site of the municipal government of Rome. And this is a collaboration with the choreographer Melissa Lohman. I'm going to do a little voiceover while this is happening. So it's a group of women, which is intentional. That this is a space that was designed by Michelangelo. It was actually only realized under Mussolini. So both very strong, powerful male figures in creating civic space in Rome. So it's significant that this is a group of women dancers who are sort of retracing and remaking this space. And that they're also in workers' clothing to show that this is an act of labor, of this process of drawing. And the instruments that they're using, which are these long rods, are sort of abstractions of compasses and other drawing tools. I'm going to skip ahead a little. So as they keep going, they start to prop themselves up with these tools and actually form images of many of the representations of women in Rome, the sort of familiar statues of a Venus figure, but then find that those can't quite hold them up. And then they end becoming a compass, mapping that space. Okay, stop there. So I've sort of continued to explore this question of representation also through writing and curatorial projects. This was a sort of curated series of images in the most recent issue of JAE, or maybe the second to last one, looking at other people who were using different materials and forms of contact to record spaces, showing how the process of documentation itself is always biased, not objective, revealing of the tools and the people who are doing the documentation. And then I wanted to show you a project that is an act of drawing on a building. So much the same way that performance was drawing on a public space and highlighting who's doing the drawing. This is a process of drawing on a building that actually remade that building as a result. So this is an installation at the Neutra VDL Studio and Residences in Los Angeles, which is a sort of iconic mid-century house. It's known for these in-between spaces that are in between inside and outside. They're sort of enclosed patios that are enclosed on three sides, but then open to the elements. So the project highlighted those spaces, and it did it by extending the materials and the grid system of the interior. So you can see here, the railing system is actually extended on the ceiling through these aluminum rods. And from that is hanging a grid of blue cords. So this happened through all three levels of the house in these sort of transitional in-between spaces that really mapped the intersection of the architecture with the elements, with nature. And you can see here how the system is really embedded. Oh, I have a pointer. It's really embedded within the existing logic of the building. So aluminum was sort of the key element that Neutra chose to highlight. He would even spray paint wood with aluminum paint so that everything looked like it was aluminum. So kind of playing with that process of deception, this project is using aluminum frames. Like you can see here, this is a new frame, but it's kind of tucked into and supported by this existing frame here. So the space is mapped by this sort of relentless grid of cords, but then they're only held down by these light fishing weights. So since they're exposed to the elements, they actually map also the range of the elements throughout the space. So the way that wind hits this structure, and it's on a reservoir, so it actually gets a lot of direct wind. And the whole thing is sort of like this jellyfish that's constantly moving throughout the day and night. And it's also moving in response to social activity, to the movement of people. So in a way, the piece is kind of performing its interaction with the outside world. So talking more directly about form, which has already come into play in those previous projects, the work that I do is very much dealing with this question of how do we respond to the formal conditions that are existing in a place and yet produce something that's distinct and different and sometimes even subversive to what I find there. So it's a process of kind of pushing and pulling, being respectful but also being a little resistant. And it's always learning from a logic that I find there and that obviously I'm perceiving with my own training, and that's biased. But so for example, in this space that is in the American Academy in Rome, I did this site-specific installation. This is the original flooring that you see there. It was a 1914 building built by McKim, Mead and White. But I was just as interested in this phenomena of patterned stone floors all around Rome, which are actually designed to have a direct impact on the movement through those spaces. So these are floors that you see in churches. And the one on the left is from a medieval church. This is actually a very common type of flooring in that area. And it was intended to guide the movement of worshipers and clergy during religious ceremonies. So the circles would tell people where to stand, and the patterns would distinguish different seating areas. So I wanted to sort of bring some of that interplay between geometry and movement into this existing site. And I looked at all the ways I could map the geometric relationships that are there and then sort of multiply and superimpose those relationships to produce something different. So the goal was to produce a kind of new series of directions of movement and attention throughout that space. This is the resulting plan, and then the way that it was executed with adhesive vinyl. And it did actually start to bring people in all these new sort of pathways through the space and to take them to the perimeter where there's this very unusual collection of sculptural fragments. So it sort of changed the content of the experience in that space. And it turned into a whole bunch of representational studies where I was looking at the medieval floors and realizing that actually the complexity came from the textures of the material itself, the veining, the color, the shifts within the marble. And in this sort of an era, as you all know, where complexity is something we usually try to derive from complex form, and digital tools, parametric design, have produced like an infinite possibility for that. But I was drawn to this kind of complexity, which is actually very simple. The geometry is extremely simple, but the complexity comes through material juxtaposition. And I started to create my own versions of this using very simple geometric patterns, but then looking at how the textures of marble and the color of marble could create this kind of visual oscillation between legibility and illegibility of the geometry. So this became multiple installations, this one at Parsons Gallery in New York. And then this formal question I'm now exploring in a new project at a bigger scale, dealing with public space. And specifically the public space of a civic building again. I tend to keep doing government buildings, which is not a bad thing, I'm not complaining. But it's a great chance to kind of contemplate what a contemporary civic space can be. So for this project at the Columbus City Hall in Columbus, Indiana, it's this SOM building from 1981, which is very monumental, very imposing, kind of a blank facade. But it's actually a very active civic space. And I wanted to do a project that would build on that would sort of enhance the civic engagement that's already there. So I looked at these different patterns of engagement, the way that the building shapes either these sort of more intimate semicircular patterns at the top or these big public experiences out on the lawn. And I wanted to do something that would keep this kind of Janus-faced orientation, but start to multiply it into new points of attention, much like the floor. So this is learning from this very intense geometry of this site, which is basically circles within squares, bisected into triangles, and sort of multiplying that to create a series of enclosures and platforms that produce what I call soft civic. So in thinking about civic space, I'm advocating for an idea of a combination of play, performance, and participation, like political participation. So that there's this kind of fluid slippage between recreational space and then a space of political empowerment. So I'm producing this project in collaboration with different community organizations in Columbus that organize either youth groups or political protests that already happen at this site. And the softness is also about the materiality. So thinking about techniques of weaving and using soft materials like rope in this case. This is a very simplistic material study, but you can see in the rendering a little closer to scale how, I'm working with this weaving workshop in Brooklyn that we're looking at actually processes of knotting and tying that can happen at a more intricate level here that use techniques that we normally associate with domestic space, but in public space, which turns something that might be intimidating and kind of alien to people into something that's more familiar and tactile and inviting. So it's intentionally a kind of reversal of your expectations for what a city hall building should be. And the structures themselves are designed to kind of house acts of protest, but also moments of sort of group meetings and participation. So this formal question is something I've written about in this book, Tabula Plana, which was looking at a series of case studies of projects that work with existing architecture and how to create actually partial form that ties together existing structures in public spaces. And it's really a different way of thinking. Again, beginning with the specific and then producing a project, rather than beginning with the abstract and applying it. So to turn to materiality, as you've already seen, there's a sort of interest in textiles and softness. And for me, it's also a very political thing. I've been teaching these courses at Columbia about feminist practice. And part of what we're looking at is this lineage of feminist textile and fiber art, which was an intentional kind of appropriation of things that have been called women's work, decorative crafts. And this is a very, charged and controversial thing. A lot of people think, well, if you embrace it, then you're just further reinforcing that association. And others say, well, that's the only way to give it validity, within a discipline where it's been really marginalized. So I'm sort of intentionally engaging that whole discourse. And for me, what's so exciting about this work is that the qualities of softness, the kind of improvisation of weaving, the surprise of tactility in our environment, I think it prompts different kinds of social interaction and really different relationships between a structure and the people who use it. So you can see that I've obviously been doing this already and sort of continuing it more with this project. But then I did have a chance to do this at a larger scale in collaboration with the office SOIL, based in New York. We did this project in Dubai as part of the Global Grad Show, which is part of Dubai Design Week. So we had a chance to do these large-scale fabric structures, which were organizing an exhibition of graduate student work. And in order to do these, it was 28,000 square feet of hand-painted fabric, which is sort of insane amount, and it was done in collaboration with Broadway set painters. So they were the only people that could handle this sort of enormous amount of fabric. And it was a constant dialogue with them about how to create this kind of improvised scatter pattern. So the form itself was also about a kind of unstructured set of chance operations. So you have the sense of these different figures that are sort of pushing on each other, jostling for space within this plan. And then in terms of creating a fabric structure, it was made with scaffolding and then fabric stretched between the scaffolding and these heavier display boxes, which were milled, that are at the bottom. So the result was these sort of splatter painting, expressionistic gestures, something we might be more familiar with on t-shirts or at the scale of the body, but to blow them up to this monumental scale was this disorienting scale shift that I think was really exciting and was meant to convey the sort of creativity and energy of the work that was being displayed. You can see here a view of how those interact. So this kind of fueled my interest in thinking about fabric at a scale and in spaces that are public in a way that we don't usually expect. These are normally intimate, domestic, smaller scale things. So then to turn to authorship, you can see that I've done collaborations in previous design projects, and that's very important to me in sort of questioning the way that as architects we work in a place. That part of this idea of the indiscrete, of being folded into the life cycles of a place, is working with people who are not architects and learning from their understanding of a site and not just our disciplinary one. So, for example, this project that I did at the Chicago Architecture Biennial with the South Shore Drill Team, which are they're from the south side of Chicago. And it was a project with many layers. I knew that I wanted to do a project at that site that would sort of heighten and amplify the relentless grid, the Miesian grid. And when I found the South Shore Drill Team, I realized that what they do is just the perfect pairing with that, because drill teams are inherently gridded operations, but they take it to a very different end than Mies did. So when we started this collaboration, it just began this process of attending the parades that they do in the neighborhoods in the South Side. I would sort of do these analytical drawings of the site to try to understand the main lines that organize the space. But then, of course, the drawings were not very relevant in rehearsals, which are really about a one-to-one, full-scale occupation and kind of dialogue through movement, not through drawing. People always ask me to see the drawings of these performances, but the drawings are actually really irrelevant because it's so much more about a kind of full-scale testing. So the resulting project basically started with this kind of reverent manifestation of the grid, and then transformed into a much more expressive hip-hop choreography and transformation of that site. So I'm going to play that performance for you. So it's important to me that these projects don't have one meaning or one message, but there's like many different interconnected layers of references and things that hopefully come through. I mean, on the one hand, it's about the complicated history of Chicago, which is an incredibly segregated city, and the way that spaces like the Inner Loop, where this construction is, were favored by the local city government over the south side of Chicago, which is, neglected in terms of basic infrastructure. But it was also, this happened during Black Lives Matter protests, when the idea of young black bodies in public space was very charged, and the fact that they're throwing guns was tapping into that conversation and sort of instead celebrating these young black people in this prominent federal plaza. So that led directly into a related project with Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York. I was asked by Ava Frank, who was the director, to collaborate with Mabel Wilson, who's an incredible historian and designer, on a project that would sort of unpack some of the many layers within that performance. So to think about what is the longer history of African American marching band performances and other marching performances in the United States. And to turn that into both a performance project and an exhibition project that would sort of show the convergence of different historical strands. And what we read about was fascinating and surprising in some ways, in that so many of these traditions originated in the military and then were appropriated and transformed for non-military celebrations. And so things like the uniform, the choreography, the music, the instruments, and then became a part of really important moments of pride and also political protests. So the history of civil rights protests with marching bands, such as Marcus Garvey's sort of parades through Harlem, made this very layered and nuanced history for us to unpack. So we worked with this group based in Harlem, the Marching Cobras of New York. They're a drum line and a dance line. And together we created this performance that referenced many different historical moments in time in Harlem. So in part it was a celebration of the history of marching in Harlem, which is, kind of under threat because the neighborhood is changing so much. There are far fewer public performances. So the performance referenced, on the one hand, the Harlem Hellfighters, which was an infantry regiment. You see referenced on the left, and then also the Silent Parade, which is a very early civil rights protest when women and children marched all in white to speak to their innocence in the face of racial violence. And to kind of tie it all together, we were looking at the theme of camouflage, because partly the military origins of marching suggested camouflage, but also that marching was this sort of accepted form of public gathering that allowed African Americans to be in public space en masse in times of segregation, when otherwise it would have been absolutely impossible. So to create this project, we did a series of workshops. We went to Marcus Garvey Park, which is where the performance took place. And what was really cool about this group is that actually a lot of the choreographers are some of the younger members of the group, so high school age, early college age. And so we kind of brainstormed with them how we could occupy this public space. And then the resulting performance involved these costumes referencing historical periods, but also these custom capes, which are referencing the long lineage of historically black colleges and universities with drum majors with these extravagant capes. And on both sides of the capes are these different camouflage patterns that are merged with the geometric patterns of the paving of the park. So you can see here how they sort of, at times, are flipping the sides of the capes in order to create different color patterns. So I'm going to play. This one's actually more of a video about the process itself.
To be black and to be in public these days, walk on a sidewalk, is often seen as a threat.
What are the politics of African American marching groups claiming public space in the United States, particularly in a moment of increasing militarization and surveillance?
I think this is a really important moment to kind of think about what is that history of the march? What is it around these drill teams, and why are these young African Americans dressed in these military costumes and throwing guns in the air?
marching was a way of actually creating public articulations of identity and of solidarity in the face of discrimination and inequality and lack of opportunities.
I was invited to collaborate with Bryony by Storefront, by Ava Frank, who had seen Bryony's performance in Chicago. I thought, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, particularly in terms of relationships of Black bodies in public space.
We really wanted this project to emerge from the process of collaboration. So we didn't go in with a fixed idea of what the performance would be. We went in with the idea that we would have a series of workshops in which we would learn about the performers.
The Marching Cobras are a drumline and dance line. They're an amazing organization whose mission is really to bring youth together, to enlighten them about different forms of performance, dance, drumming.
We like to show off different types of dances, so majorette, ballet, modern, and we like to show off our flexibility, so like leg lifts, splits, and drops.
It takes them off the street, but in an odd way, it puts them back on the street, but with a different agenda. Part of what the Cobras actually do for the youth is this sense of polish, professionalism, but a kind of fearlessness and fierceness of being in public.
The things that I've been doing now is things that I would never have imagined even. Like, we just performed for Rihanna, so I got to meet her, and that was amazing.
So when it's time to work, we drum, we dance, we have fun. When it's chill time, everybody hangs out, everybody laughs, we're together.
Marcus Garvey Park had been, with the gentrification of Harlem, a site of contention.
It's been famous for having drum circles there since the 70s. And that was historically a really important moment, a kind of gathering moment in the week for people who lived in the neighborhood. But now that the properties around the park have been developed, the demographics of the neighborhood are changing rapidly. There have been a lot of noise complaints about sound in the park.
That seemed to fit in very well with some of the issues we wanted to explore with Marching On.
As architects or as designers, we're thinking about the organization of the performance in space. They start on the street, they go into the park, and then they end up back on the street. So that was very important, that it almost felt more kind of woven or stitched into the public life of the city.
We went over this and over this and over this, and we got it right. And it was like different because it was something like that we never do.
The idea of camouflage was really important for us also visually in the design of the costumes for the performance, in which the performers would sort of blend in with the landscape but then also pop out from it. The way that marching band formations themselves had acted like a kind of camouflage that enabled people to be in public space when otherwise that kind of mass gathering and presence would have been forbidden.
The all-white represents military style, how marching bands before used to perform and march through the streets, and kind of represents like peace. And then this side is like our colors. The now part of the marching bands that represent us. So it was like we transformed into the Cobras, who we usually are and stuff.
I really like how with the capes, the dancers wore one color and the drummers wore another color, but at the end we all came together in one color.
Using the prop is like, it gives you another way of expressing yourself.
The most remarkable moment was to watch the Cobras actually perform in the park. Not because it was part of Storefront or Performa, but because I think the Cobras themselves may have learned something about the history of their own medium of performance. They kind of recognized that and maybe even owned that legacy. For me, was a remarkable moment.
So that became an exhibition at Storefront for Art and Architecture, which was taking pieces of the archival photographs and sort of historical narratives that we found, and then showing them in this chronological sequence where the black and the white at the distance there is the 19th century material moving through 20th century material into the present and documenting the performance that took place. And you can see how the theme of camouflage also influenced the way that we exhibited the photographs. And that space became setting for more performances, for public conversations about the role of marching in New York and how that's changed over time. And I've sort of written further about this, thinking about how performance itself can be a transformative tool for the performers and for our expectations for public space. So I'll just sort of wrap up by giving you a taste of how I think this approach can influence architectural education and the things that you all are doing. So with representation, with my students, I often ask them to try to represent things that can't be represented, that are intangible or about change over time or experience of sensation. So for example, here a student is trying to represent change over time in a building, the many different phases of construction and transformation, or students representing sound in this case, looking at the way the acoustics of a prison shaped how that architecture conditioned prisoner experiences, or how surveillance changed over time in that same prison building, which was one of our studio sites. In terms of form, so I always give them sites that are these sort of impossible convergences of architectural history, social history, urban change, and sort of political conflict, and then they have to figure it out. And part of what I encourage is thinking about a series of different architectural moves that are related to create a complicated whole or complex whole. So an idea of relational parts, where as someone experiencing one of these projects, you would sort of discover the whole as you move through the site, and you discover different relationships to the existing. And that can be very challenging also towards the existing conditions, such as these sort of projects that deconstructed a prison building in Norway and saw it as almost raw material for transformation. This project with students, I showed a little bit at the beginning, was actually a sort of real project in Norway where we challenged the government planning process for the government quarter, which is a site that had been bombed in a terrorist attack. It was sort of their ground zero, September 11th ground zero. And we basically proposed a way to integrate new construction into this complex relationship of historic buildings by thickening the ground plane and changing the urban relationships on either side. And that became a point of, we were part of the official planning process, but we were the sort of controversial activist team that was advocating for this greater stitching together of the new and the old, and ended up actually garnering a lot of popular support in the process and kind of changing the conversation about what was possible there. In terms of materiality, in this recent studio I mentioned, the students are experimenting with reclaiming these forms of women's work, of domestic labor, trying to make maps and drawings using weaving, and also exploring the potential for color, texture, and pattern in design. And so this was one student's project for a collective co-working space for women that also involved a medical clinic and was created through drones weaving carbon fiber around these prefab steel structures. And then for most of my studios, I sort of create the opportunity for students to work directly with community groups in a specific site, such as this project in Harlyn, where we were working on the future of these historic churches that are falling into disrepair because the congregations are so small and they don't have enough funding to maintain them. So we created a kind of economic, architectural, and social set of possibilities and presented them in the church through an exhibition that we designed and built, and included oral histories and other material that we'd gathered about the social history of that place. So I'm working on sort of tying all these things together through my own writing, and talking about this way of having a new source of knowledge for architecture that is situated and bodily, as I talked about. And so one of the ways I'm doing that is a forthcoming issue of Log, which I'm editing next. It'll come out next spring, so 2020, and is looking at this range of really exciting contemporary practices that are questioning how architects act in the world, a lot of them motivated by social justice issues, but they're restructuring their own roles as architects and where the funding comes from, how they interact with users and clients, how they build community support. So it's sort of foregrounding that and asking how that changes the way that we think about what architecture is. So, yeah. Thank you. I'm happy to hear any questions.
Awesome. Okay, let's hear your questions. And you can be indiscreet.
Yes, you can be
Ask
indiscreet.
your most indiscreet question. George.
I really liked your sort of design ideas for the civic building and incorporating some more playful and tactile structures around there. There's a competition that's coming up pretty soon about redesigning a different type of civic building than a police station and trying to make it more like incorporate sort of like a warm community. And I was just wondering if you had any more comments on that project, or any other projects like it, maybe?
Yeah. It's funny because there's a police station underneath the city hall in that building. So it's actually a combination of both. I mean, I think I am always like a sort of difficult person for people to hire because I believe in being critical of the place, and like policing is obviously a very complicated thing these days. I think designing anything in a police station would need to come to terms with that. And I think it is more than just making things that are like soft and nice and comfortable, but what I'm really hoping will come from that project through the sort of programming and planning that I'm doing is that it is a forum for debate and discussion and political representation, particularly for young people in that town, because we was looking at these studies of how there's sort of high levels of sense of disengagement, of like apathy, of feeling lost. And so the project is primarily focused on the kind of young youth population to sort of help them feel like they have a voice in civic government, basically.
I have a question, thought, observation. I really appreciate the way you began by thinking about the surveying of existing conditions as a prelude to a proposition. And within the scope of existing conditions, you include social use.
Yeah.
And that's not something that we normally think about as existing conditions because we look for the hard lines of urban patterns, but social use as existing conditions. I guess that this isn't turning into a question exactly. But how does one survey that? Actually, I was just at the University of Pennsylvania again this weekend, and on exhibition they had some drawings by Lawrence Halprin, who I'm sure you know, hailing from Los Angeles. So, and he showed some examples of how you study social use, and certainly the marching is a form of social use. How does one study social use as an architect?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, I think there's tools that we're familiar with that usually involve mapping and a level of abstraction. I usually don't let my students do that because I think if we only have to like map the line of movement, it's such an abstraction and reduction of how someone experiences that space that it doesn't actually tell us that much more than the plan does. So that studio with the prison in Norway, that was a very focused effort to ask students to represent experience in its kind of full sensory dimensions. So students focus on different things like touch, sound, smell, light, and had to invent ways of drawing those things. So on the one hand, there's like that dimension, but then, I mean, I feel like the only way to really learn about it is by talking to people and having interpersonal relationships. So particularly long-term relationships with community groups or people who live somewhere, and doing oral histories, asking them about it, because there's so much that you can't find in archives that isn't documented. You know, when we were working on that church project, to know what it's like to sit in the sanctuary during, you know, a Sunday morning in 1975. Like, you can only really find that out by talking to someone who was there, and then trying to figure out, well, what are the phrases from that conversation that could communicate this to somebody else? You know, so there's always a level of abstraction, but I think there's a richness and a kind of evocative quality that you get from conversation.
It's not something you can take a picture of.
Yeah.
And like you said, oral history played a key role in your exhibitions.
Yeah.
Other questions?
I can speak up.
I think they needed to record you for longevity.
Thank you. You know, you gave me a lot to think about, all of us, I imagine, a lot to think about. When I think of this, your terms of representation for materiality, those are clear. Authorship, I assume that you're talking about the events or the people who would rightfully take ownership or have taken ownership of that space at some point in the past, or the authorship that's brought to that space through the people who are engaging it? That's my first question.
Yeah, so for me, it's a way of questioning how architects operate in the world. That I don't believe in the sort of single genius architect who, you know, comes up with an idea and then implements it. I'm more interested in the kind of feedback loop of communication, collaborative processes.
Now I get it. I'm slow, perhaps. You know, you're questioning all of these
yes.
In as much as you're providing insight, you're questioning those. So how would you, say, characterize your role as an architect as opposed to being an environmental artist or a performance artist? Because these are the questions that both disciplines or forms of art practice embody, right? An environmental artist will look at all of these things, but they don't call themselves architects, nor will the performance artists. How do you differentiate yourself then as an architect within this?
Well, a couple of things. I think for one, intellectually the work is in dialogue with architectural history and theory. So that's the kind of context that the ideas, the methods, the techniques are developed in response to. I also think for me, because I did study art in undergrad and then went into architecture, and for me there's a very big difference in the mindset of the two. That for me, architecture is fundamentally a service. It's producing an outcome.
It's what?
It's a service. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. It's producing an outcome. So it's goal-oriented, whereas art practice, in my mind, is not. Obviously, we can debate this forever. And social practice, sorry?
I wouldn't debate it forever. I think categorically there are similarities. I think art is also a service.
Sure, but how, like a more abstract service, perhaps.
But you're speaking to the social outcome as part of your project.
Well, my projects are always very, I mean, they are actually quite client-driven, which I know doesn't necessarily come across, but I'm always working with an institution, and that relationship is very much driving the work, so that I'm producing a transformation in that world that I've been invited into. And whereas in art practice, I think the work is meant to stand on its own, perhaps without delivering an outcome to its users or its client. And I'm interested in the constraint of that relationship, the fact that there are demands placed on you that you deliver. and also that the constraints of architectural discourse as reference points for what I do, so that like that is what's producing the layers of significance in the choices about representation, form, materiality.
Yeah, it's very clear with the historical and theoretical framing of the work. And in fact, the way that we got connected is because I included part of your work in an essay I was writing about theory's theatricality. And this exemplifies ways in which architecture theory can be performative. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jonesboro, and I'm a third-year student in interior environments. And this semester we did a course in history of classical interiors, and I just noticed like in a lot of your work there was a lot of stuff that I could relate to based on what I studied. Like you kept mentioning symmetry, and that's like among the classical framework that we studied this semester. So I was just wondering, do you, like, even with your time in Rome and till today, do you still, as you're doing your work, do you still notice that you're probably using like the same framework in design?
Yeah, so you touched on some of my favorite things. When I loved being in Italy because it was this window to a world of design that I felt like I had not been allowed to look at in architecture school, because I was sort of taught in a neo-modernist tradition. And you know, in ancient Rome, but also in the medieval period, there's this explosion of ornament and pattern and texture. I mean, there's such kind of richness in the materiality that to our eyes it actually looks gaudy a lot of the time and tacky, right? To have that much marble and all these different kinds of it. But I found it really inspiring because it was sort of like a way of opening up another kind of thinking. And so, yeah, like you're saying, there are these kind of geometrical organizing principles that are very basic, that have kind of continued through time from that period, and I find them still useful. I think it's also interesting how much you can see them in modernism, in these different periods, even if people don't admit to it. And like I talked about with the marble collages, that I think that complexity is something that can come from very simple geometry. If there's a great attention to material and detail and how something's executed, that it doesn't have to be like wild and crazy to be really rich and satisfying. So yeah, I think actually claiming a kind of classical tradition or medieval tradition can be very like radical in certain climates. Obviously, like postmodernism was partly about classical form, but I think in a different way, in more of a symbolic way than what I'm interested in.
The great modernist Adolf Loos recovered the classics and also used amazing marble patterns.
Yeah, kind of following up on that. I mean, I was going to ask just generally if you wanted to say about how this work connects about the preservation discipline. But more generally, also to recall that for me, the first time I became aware of your work was the first blog issue at blog 31, called New Ancients.
Yeah.
And in there, you talk about this theme that we try to push, integrating innovation and tradition, or breaking down some of the, I think, destructive polemic about the relation of the new and the old.
Yeah.
And so, in terms of philosophy of history, or philosophy of preservation, that becomes embedded in philosophy of design work.
Right.
Maybe if you could just speak about the preservation side of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've kind of been moving between the worlds of architecture and preservation the last couple of years, and part of this sort of experimental preservation club, you could say. And I guess, for me, this is kind of the core of it, that it's a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking of design as emerging from what you find rather than dropping something in from the outside. But that's something that I think is shared across different disciplines. And what's been exciting in the last couple of years is that increasingly people are seeing preservation as a creative act, which is something that I argue for, and Jorge Otero Payos, who runs the preservation program at Columbia, has been like very explicit about. Because I think the more we see that preservation is a creative reframing of the existing, both materially and conceptually, the more we see that and architecture, and particularly architecture reuse, as like being one problem, one process. Because I think the division between preservation and architecture is totally unnecessary, particularly, and it's also delusional. I mean, all of the architects I know, a huge number of their projects are renovations. And so dealing with existing buildings is absolutely necessary, and yet it's not taught as like part of the aspiration of creative work. And I think that's missing a whole potential for really meaningful projects.
Excellent, thank you very much.